Hello, I'm Keith Hockton, author, historian, and host of Rearview Mirror Chronicles, where we take a look back at the people and the moments that shaped our world through history. Picture the most beautiful place that you have ever heard of. Northwest of Beijing, in the early 19th century, there was a landscape that had taken more than 100 years to create. Not a palace, a world. Lakes that had been dug by hand, shaped like the lakes in classical paintings. Hills raised where no hills had been before. Hundreds of pavilions, temples, libraries, theaters, halls, scattered across thousands of acres of engineered wilderness. Streams that had been taught where to wander. Gardens within gardens within gardens. There was even a corner built in the European style, with marble facades, fountains, Baroque flourishes, designed by Jesuit missionaries for an employer who was curious what the other side of the world looked like. The Chinese called it the Garden of Perfect Brightness. Foreigners would come to call it the Old Summer Palace, which I think rather undersells it. It wasn't a holiday home. The Forbidden City was where the Qing emperors held court, their office, their stage, their ceremonial heart, if you like. The garden was where they actually lived, where they read, where they wrote, painted, and governed. It held the accumulated treasures of a civilization. Silks, porcelains, bronzes, jades, paintings, and of course, the great manuscript libraries of the empire. It had stood growing lovelier by the decade for over 100 years. So just hold that picture. Keep it somewhere safe, because by the end of this episode, everything I've just described to you will be on fire. Burned deliberately, building by building, on the orders of the British Earl, whose father would later take the marbles from the Parthenon. So how do you get from a trade dispute over tea, a minor trade dispute over tea, and opium to columns of smoke visible over the walls of Beijing? That story is the story of how the 19th century actually worked. So last time we watched the fuse being lit, a Britain soaked in laudanum at home, an East India Company growing opium by the ton in Bengal and then auctioning it off, deniability, profitability to private traders who smuggled it up the Chinese coast, silver draining out of China, an emperor choosing suppression over legislation, the incorruptible commissioner, Lin, seizing and destroying 20,000 chests of British-owned opium at Humen, and one very overwhelmed British official, Charles Elliot, promising, with no authority whatsoever, that the British government would pay the traders for every single chest. That promise, plus a dead villager, a siege, some wounded prize, and a razor-thin vote in the House of Commons, put the largest fleet to sea that Britain had ever put to sea in 1840. So now the fleet arrives, and the two empires that barely understood each other are about to discover just how differently they've spent the last 50 years. So let me start with a single ship, because there's an irony about the name. And this ship tells you almost everything about how this war was going to go. She was called the Nemesis. Someone in the naming department clearly had a sense of occasion, and she was, I think by the standards of the day, a strange and slightly disreputable vessel. Not a proud ship of the line, not a towering three-decker bristling with cannon. She was built of iron, driven by steam paddle wheels, and she was sat so shallow in the water that she could go where no serious warships had any business going. Up rivers, across mudflats, into estuaries, creeks, and winding inner waterways of the Chinese coast that had been so defensible so far. And you know what? That actually mattered enormously. For centuries, China's coastal defenses had been built on a sound assumption that was Deep draft sailing ships must stay in deep water, and they can only move when the wind and the tide permit. Forts were actually positioned accordingly. Sandbars and shallows were natural shields. A war junk might not match a European frigate gun for gun, but the geography was on the defender's side. Steam absolutely abolishes that assumption. The Nemesis could move against the wind, against the current, against the tide. She could actually tow becalmed warships into position and shrug off shots that would have splintered traditional oak. She carried her guns and rockets up the narrow waterways that had once been China's protected interior. The defenders weren't fighting a better version of the enemy they'd prepared for. They were fighting a different category of enemy altogether. And behind that one ship stood something bigger, a Royal Navy at its absolute peak. This was a navy fresh from the long wars against the Napoleonic French, a generation of officers and men hardened by the largest conflict Britain had ever fought, drilled in gunnery, logistics, and amphibious operations. And it was backed for the first time by the products of the Industrial Revolution. It was, at that moment, probably the most capable instrument of war on the planet. Just let that sink in for a minute. The campaign itself actually played out with a grim, repetitive rhythm. The fleet blockaded ports, it seized the island of Chusan, it battered coastal forts into silence in hours. Engagements the British recorded as skirmishes and the Chinese experienced as catastrophes. Chinese soldiers, and I think it's important to say this plainly, they often fought with extraordinary courage. Garrisons stood and died at their guns against an enemy that they could barely reach. Some commanders, seeing the fight was hopeless, took their own lives rather than survive the defeat. Courage simply wasn't the variable that decided anything at all. The technological gulf was just too wide. And there's a strange, tragicomic interlude in the middle of all this, if you like. In early 1841, Charles Elliot negotiated a preliminary deal with the emperor's envoy, Kushan. Britain took Hong Kong, demanded payment, and forced direct trade. And both sides were actually left very angry. London thought Elliot had settled for scandalously little. Palmerston, the foreign secretary, wrote witheringly that he treated his instructions as waste paper and dismissed Hong Kong as a barren island with hardly a house upon it that no one would want. Beijing, meanwhile, concluded that Qishan had given away scandalously much. He was actually then stripped of his titles and relieved of his enormous fortune, and then hauled back to the capital in chains in disgrace. Think about that. The two men who had actually looked across the table at each other and tried to stop the war were both disgraced by their own governments for trying. And if you want a single anecdote that captures how much appetite there was for compromise, well, that's the one. Elliot was then replaced by Sir Henry Pottinger, a man sent out with instructions to stop negotiating and start winning. In 1842, the campaign moved into its decisive phase. North into the mouth of the Yangtze, the great river artery from central China. The fighting at Xiangjiang, where the river meets the Grand Canal, was some of the most brutal of the entire war. The Manchu garrison there fought almost to annihilation, and many of the defenders killed their own families before the city fell, rather than let them be taken. The actual fleet did the thing that ended the war. It didn't storm Beijing. It didn't need to. By anchoring at the junction of the Yangtze and the Grand Canal, it actually placed its hand on the empire's windpipe, the canal system that carried rice, grain, and tax revenue from the productive south to the capital in the north. And then British warships appeared off Nanjing, a former imperial capital, one of the most storied cities in China, absurdly far from the sea for any previous seaborne enemy. The court decided it had seen enough. The Treaty of Nanking was signed in August 1842 aboard a British warship, HMS Cornwallis, anchored just off the city. And I think it's worth slowing down on the terms because this document actually set the template for everything that followed, not just for Britain, but for every Western power dealing with China for the next 150 years. Hong Kong, Palmerston's barren island, was ceded to Britain outright. 5 ports were open to British trade and residents: Canton, Amoy, Foochow, Ningpo, and Shanghai. The Kohong monopoly, that guild of licensed Chinese middlemen that I introduced to you in the last episode, well, they were abolished. British merchants could now trade with whomever they liked, and China would pay an indemnity of 21 million silver dollars. That one's definitely worth sitting with for a second, because what it means is that China had to pay the costs of a war fought against it, including compensation for the destroyed opium, the drug that was actually illegal under China's own hands. Beijing was, in effect, billed for Eliot's promise. Then came the supplementary agreement, which added 2 provisions that would poison everything quietly for a century. The first was extraterritoriality. British subjects in China accused of crimes would be tried by British officials under British law, not Chinese law, no matter where that crime had happened or who the victim was. And you can actually see the logic that the British told themselves. Chinese and European ideas of justice were very different. And after the Lin affair, neither side trusted the other's courts. But sit with that for what it actually created: a class of foreigners on Chinese soil who were, in every practical sense, above the law of the land. Every future incident, every drunken sailor, every trigger-happy trader would now be handled by a system that the Chinese regarded, I think with much justification, as institutionalized impunity. The second was the most favored nation clause. Any concession China granted to any other power would automatically flow to Britain as well. The Americans and the French turned up 2 years later and signed their own contracts, their own versions, with that same clause, which meant that every country's demands ratcheted every other country upward. China could effectively never make a limited concession to anyone. Every door opened for one power swung open for every other foreign power. And here's the detail that people tend to find hardest to believe. You know, the treaty said nothing about opium, not a single word. The substance the war would forever be named for goes entirely unmentioned in the document that ended it. The trade just simply carried on, technically illegal, completely unpunished, and growing. In the years after the war, it actually flowed into China in greater volume than ever. But instead of now flowing into one port, because of the agreement, it was now allowed into 5. The Chinese would come to call Nanking the first of the unequal treaties, and the name is stuck because it's entirely accurate. It wasn't a settlement between 2 states negotiating, it was terms dictated at the point of naval guns by one empire that had just discovered it could do whatever it liked to another that had just discovered that it couldn't actually stop them. For Britain, it was a triumph. There were church bells ringing in London, editorials, promotions. You know, for China, it was a wound, and the men governing it knew exactly how deep that wound went. A small but serious group of Chinese scholars and officials began asking very hard questions almost immediately. How did we lose? What do those ships and guns consist of? What else will these people want? One of them, a scholar by the name of Wei Yuan, compiled a massive study of the maritime nations, an attempt, I suppose, decades ahead of its moment to try and understand the enemy. And he proposed a simple, radical idea. Learn the superior techniques of the barbarians in order to control them. Almost nobody in power listened. Well, not yet. The court preferred to file away the war as a frontier disturbance, something that was regrettable that they had contained. Hold on to that gap between the people who understood something fundamental had changed and an establishment that dearly wanted it not to have. And that gap is one of the engines of everything that then follows from this moment. So there's peace of sorts. It lasts about 14 years and it satisfies absolutely no one. The British merchants are disappointed, which kind of tells you, something about their expectations. They had convinced themselves that beyond the treaty ports lay a bottomless market. 400 million customers for Lancashire cotton. And of course, the reality was deflating. China remained what it had always been: enormous, self-sufficient, and largely uninterested. One optimistic manufacturer famously calculated that if every Chinese person merely lengthened their shirt by a few inches, the mills of England would spin for a generation. The shirts stayed the same length. The one import that reliably grew was the one nobody put on letterhead: opium. The Chinese side, well, the picture was darker. And this is probably the moment to mention that something that usually gets left out of the Opium War story. And it shouldn't be, because I think it dwarfs it. In 1850, southern China erupted into the Taiping Rebellion, which was a massive civil war. Its leader was a failed examination candidate who had come to believe, after contact with missionary tracts, that he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ, sent to establish a heavenly kingdom on earth. Over the next 14 years, the rebellion and its suppression killed somewhere in the region of 20 million people. It's one of the deadliest conflicts in human history, and outside China, hardly anyone has heard of it. So picture the Qing court in the 1850s, properly. A government fighting for its actual survival against a rebel state that had carved out the richest provinces of the empire and taken Nanjing as its capital at the same time, effectively fielding a rolling series of demands from foreign consuls about treaty rights, port access, and tariff schedules. Beijing wasn't being obstinate for the fun of it. It was actually drowning. In that situation, the treaty system keeps feeding friction. Foreign merchants, pushed at the edges of their privileges, missionaries, newly confident and not always careful, pushed past the treaty ports into the interior, where they were sometimes robbed, they were sometimes killed, and always a diplomatic incident waiting to happen. Local officials caught between furious foreign consuls and their own furious populations, well, the only thing they could do was stall and deflect. The city of Canton became the symbol of it all. The treaty said foreigners could enter. The population and the governor actually had no intention of letting them in. And so the question of whether Englishmen could walk through a particular gate became, absurdly, one of the great diplomatic issues of the age. There was one really ambiguous winner in these wars, and it wasn't a government. It was Shanghai. In 1842, it had been a respectable walled country town at the mouth of the Yangtze. Within a generation, it was on its way to becoming the great hybrid metropolis of Asia. Foreign settlements spread among the muddy waterfront that would become the Bund, and trading houses, banks, and godowns rose on land leased in perpetuity. It became a city administered in part by foreigners under foreign law on Chinese soil. The opium trade, well, that naturally moved to where the money was. The old smuggling stations gave way to receiving ships anchored openly off the new ports. The great firms that we met in the last episode, Jardine Matheson, chief among them, ran the drugs alongside tea and silk as a routine department of a diversified business. The clippers were the fastest and the most beautiful ships on the coast. The trade nobody would defend by name had actually become their infrastructure. And in the foreign merchant communities and the consulates, a conviction hardened. The treaty hadn't gone far enough. China hadn't really opened. It had been propped ajar. What was needed, and people were actually saying this quite openly, was another war, a short one, a corrective one. The only thing missing, of course, was a pretext. And keep in mind, folks, this is the 19th century, so pretexts were never in short supply for very long. In October 1856, Chinese Marines boarded a small trading vessel anchored off Canton. a Lorca, one of those hybrid ships with a European hull and Chinese rigging that were common on the coast. She was called the Arrow. Her crew were Chinese, and some of them, in all likelihood, were involved in piracy and smuggling, which is why the authorities wanted them. So 12 men were arrested. And really, that should have been that, except the Arrow had at some point been registered in Hong Kong, which made her arguably a British vessel. Her nominal captain was a 21-year-old Irishman who actually wasn't even aboard at the time. Her Hong Kong registration had in fact expired days before the boarding, a detail that the British authorities knew and decided to ignore. The British consul claimed that her crew had been arrested under a flying Union Jack. The Chinese Marines denied it, and given the expired registration, she had no right to fly the Union Jack anyway. So tally it up. A possibly British flag on a technically unregistered ship with an absent captain and a crew of Chinese probable pirates. And out of all of that came a war. The consul was a man named Harry Parkes, and he deserves a moment because personalities actually matter in this story. Parkes had been in China since boyhood. He'd been at the signing of the Treaty of Nanking as a teenager. He spoke the language and he knew the system. He'd spent his entire life inside the pressure cooker of Anglo-Chinese relations, absorbing all the confidence and all the contempt that came with it. I think he was brave, he was tireless, and he was very quick, and precisely the wrong man to have on the spot when the moment needed someone willing to let a small thing disappear. Of course, facing him was the governor at Canton, Yi Mingchen, a man of genuine principle, a scholar official who actually made his name suppressing rebels, and every bit as immovable as Parkes. Yi's position was, on the narrow legal facts side, bloody strong. Parkes actually demanded the crew's return and a public apology. Yi returned the crew and declined the apology, and Parkes, with the enthusiastic backing of the governor of Hong Kong, well, he called in the Navy. British warships began bombarding Canton, a city of 1 million people, on a regular schedule. And there's something almost surreal in the record, guns firing into the governor's compound at stated intervals as a form of almost punctuation for diplomatic correspondence. When news of all this reached London, something remarkable happened. The system briefly, it actually worked. The government's own law officers had doubts about the legal case. The opposition smelled blood, and Parliament staged one of the great debates of the century. Richard Cobden, the free trade radical, moved a motion of censure. Gladstone rose again, 16 years after his maiden denunciation of the First Chinese War, which I mentioned to you in the last episode, and told the House that a greater wrong had been committed by a strong nation against a weak one. The censure passed. Palmerston, the old lion, now Prime Minister, the same man who as Foreign Secretary had sent the first fleet in, lost the vote. And here's the lesson in how these things actually work. It didn't matter. Palmerston dissolved Parliament and took the question to the country. He ran, in effect, as the defender of the flag against insolent foreigners. The press had rechristened the governor, the insolent barbarian at Canton, and won handsomely. The voters of Britain, offered a clear choice between conscience and prestige, actually chose prestige without much visible struggle. The MPs who had led the moral case, Cobden and John Bright among them, they lost their seats. So the war was on. It just needed to wait its turn, because in 1857, the Indian Rebellion erupted as well, and every soldier and ship earmarked for China was diverted to the desperate business of holding India. It's worth also pausing on that coincidence. In the same 18 months, Britain's empire in Asia was fighting to keep one vast Asian population subjugated and to force another vast Asian population into an illegal trade. The machinery actually handled both. So Britain didn't go back to China alone. France decided it would throw its hand in too. And the reason France came is one of the stranger corners of this particular story. France had no great commercial stakes in China, no Lancashire mills, no opium fleets. What France had was a self-appointed role as the protector of Catholic missionaries across Asia. And it was a role that it took seriously as a matter of national prestige. And in February 1856, in a remote district of Guangxi province, a French missionary named Father Auguste Chapdelaine was arrested by a local Chinese magistrate, tortured, and then executed gruesomely. He'd been traveling deep into the interior, far beyond where any treaty actually permitted foreigners to go. And look, it was by any measure an atrocity. It was also, the French government decided, a cause for war. So arriving conveniently, just as Britain was looking for a partner, with a very sincere sense of outrage and cold opportunism, well, it produced the decision, and the result was a joint expedition. British and French forces, side by side, sailing to make war on China. Each partner slightly wary of the other, each determined that whatever was extracted, the other shouldn't get more. And notice what the coalition actually consisted of. One power going to war, at bottom, over trade, with opium unspoken but omnipresent in the ledgers, and another going to war over the right of its missionaries to preach anywhere in China. So effectively, commerce and Christianity, hand in hand, marching together under naval guns. And ironically, this is also where the Americans now come along as officially neutral, with diplomats trailing the fleet to collect whatever privileges emerged. And of course, the Russians were then hovering on the edges, playing a very subtler game, representing themselves in Beijing as the reasonable friend who could restrain the maritime barbarians for a price yet to be named later in territory. The war itself, when it finally began in earnest, followed the First War's script with a bigger cast, if you like. You know, Canton was taken at the end of 1857. Governor Yi had refused to negotiate, refused to flee, and also refused to prepare, reasoning, kind of with fatal calm that the foreigners had been beaten off before and that he would do it again. Of course, he was captured in the city that he had refused to abandon. And he was then shipped to British India, where he died in chains in exile. And his city would be run by an Anglo-French commission for the next 4 years. A Chinese city of 1 million people administered by foreign occupier years before anyone in Europe considered themselves formally at war with China at all. And let's just take a quick break, and we'll be back in a second with part 2. Autonomous is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much, much more than that. When you sign up with Autonomous, you become part of a larger community. A community that actually cares about you and your family in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. For more information, go talk to TG or WhatsApp him on +60 12 49 37 270 or visit their website penangmyhome.com. And we're back. Of course, then the fleet went north, basically because they could, and this time it went for the jugular. At the mouth of the High River stood the Taku forts, guiding the water road to Tianjin, and Tianjin, 90-odd miles from Beijing, where the rivers and the Grand Canal converge, was the capital's gate. So in May 1858, the forts were battered and then taken, and gunboats then pushed upriver. With foreign warships at the gate of the capital's own port city, the court did what it had done at Nanjing 16 years earlier. It sent negotiators. The treaties of Tianjin was signed that June, with Britain, France, Russia, and America turning the ratchet yet again. 10 more ports were opened, including ports far up the Yangtze in the heart of the country. Foreigners could now travel to the interior under passport. Missionaries could now preach anywhere, protected. Another indemnity and 2 provisions that mattered more than all the rest. Firstly, foreign powers would station permanent ambassadors in Beijing. And to modern ears, that sounds like nothing, I guess. That's simply what diplomacy is. But to the Qing court, it was a demand aimed at the very heart of how the empire understood itself. There was no foreign ministry in Beijing because in the imperial cosmology, there were no equals to conduct relations with. Foreign envoys were tributaries by definition. The emperor had no peers. Now picture a resident ambassador, a barbarian official living permanently in the capital, meeting the court as an equal, bowing rather than kneeling. That wasn't an administrative detail. It was public and a permanent declaration that the Chinese world was now over. The court would fight, literally fight, over that particular clause. And second, tucked into the tariff schedule negotiated alongside the treaties, opium was legalized. Call it what it was. After 2 decades of war, of blockade and diplomacy, the drug at the bottom of everything was now a lawful import, taxed at the customs house like cotton or clocks. The argument for it was the pragmatist argument we heard initially in the Chinese court some 20 years before. It's coming in anyway, better to tax it and to make some money off it. That argument had finally won, imposed from outside at gunpoint. A trade, if you like, too embarrassing to name in 1842 was, by 1858, simply an item in a schedule. The Russians, for their part, collected their fee for friendship. The Treaty of Anjou, signed the same summer, quietly transferred to Russia an enormous tract of territory north of the Amur River, land that was actually the size of several European countries, gained by the Russians without firing a shot, by the power that had positioned itself as China's helpful friend. The envoys sailed away satisfied, agreeing to return the following year to ratify everything in Beijing. And then someone had to explain the terms to the emperor. The emperor at that stage was not quite 30. He had inherited the throne from his father, who had actually lost the First War. Confronted with the resident minister's clause, the court began looking for ways to unpick what its negotiators had signed. Ratify, perhaps, but implement slowly, reinterpret for sure, and also try and relocate. Anything but permit foreign ambassadors to live in Beijing as equals. Meanwhile, the command of the capital's approaches had been given to a man absolutely worth knowing about, Sengi Ridchin, a Mongol prince of the old school, a cavalry general who had made his reputation destroying a Taiping army in the north. While the diplomats exchanged notes, he rebuilt the Taku forts, properly this time, new batteries, booms, and chains across the river, staked mudflats, and crucially, discipline. Gun crews trained to hold fire and hold their nerve. In June 1859, the British returned to the river mouth with their diplomats and an escort of gunboats and found the channel blocked. They decided, with the particular confidence of men who had never yet been beaten in China, to force it, exactly as they had the year before. The forts were silent as they came in. Matting covered the estuaries. It looked, the officers thought, satisfyingly abandoned. Suddenly, the matting came off and the guns were run out. The silent forts turned out to contain a garrison waiting at trained weapons at almost point-blank range. Gunboats were sunk in the channel. The British admiral was badly wounded. A landing party of Marines charged across the mudflats at low tide into mud that swallowed men to the waist, under fire the whole way. The survivors floundered back at nightfall. Hundreds of casualties and in the middle of the disaster, one of history's small, absurd footnotes. The commander of an officially neutral American squadron, watching from the anchorage, ordered his ships in, towing British boats, carrying British wounded out of the fight. His explanation for this creative, interpretation of neutrality was that blood is thicker than water. The phrase entered the language of Anglo-American friendship. The neutrality didn't survive the afternoon. In Beijing, there was jubilation. And you know what? You can hardly blame them. The invincible barbarians had been met, mangled, and turned away. Rin Chen was the hero of the hour, and the court allowed itself to believe the crisis had passed, that firmness had been the answer all along. I have to say, it's probably the most expensive victory in the dynasty's history. The one thing a prestige empire can't absorb is a defeat, and Britain now regarded the ambush not as a battle lost, but as an insult that absolutely required correction. And you know what? The next year, they came back with an army. That force that assembled off the Chinese coast in the summer of 1860 was of a different order to anything that had come before. Some 11,000 British and Indian troops, 7,000 French, and 200 ships, and a piece of equipment making its debut in war for the first time, the Armstrong gun, a rifle breech-loading field piece that could land shells with unprecedented accuracy at unprecedented range. The Industrial Revolution had had another 20 years to compound, and it showed. This time, there was no gallant charge up the river channel. The armies landed up the coast, marched overland, and took the Taku forts from behind, where the great guns couldn't point. Richen's fortifications, so lethal from the river, fell in a single morning. Tianjin was occupied, and the army started up the road, then to Beijing. The court, playing for time, asked for diplomatic talks. What happened next turned into a war of something completely darker. A negotiating party rode out under a flag of truce. Harry Parkes among them, inevitably along with a Times correspondent, a few officers, and an escort of Sikh cavalrymen. 39 men in all. On Richen's orders, they were arrested mid-negotiation and handed to the imperial justice system, which treated them not as envoys but as rebels. They were bound with wetted cords that tightened as they dried, cutting into the bone. They were kept in conditions that killed. Parkes himself, ironically, was held in relative comfort for the most of it, and he actually survived. But 20 of the 39 didn't, including the Times correspondent. The bodies returned to the Allied camp were in a state the soldiers who received them said they would never forget. Militarily, the end was swift. At the 8 Mile Bridge, Richen threw his Mongol cavalry against the Allied line. This was actually, the last great mounted force of the steppe tradition, the arm that had once conquered every single empire under the Genghis Khans. They charged blindly into Armstrong's guns and rifle volleys. They then reformed and charged again with a bravery that actually moved even the men killing them. It was the death of an entire military world in an afternoon. And of course now, the road to Beijing was completely open. And I think it's worth pausing on who was doing the fighting on the Allied side, because British Army kind of undersells it. A large share of the troops who marched on Beijing were actually Indian. They were actually Sikh cavalry and Punjabi infantry, men recruited from a subcontinent that Britain had finished resubjugating barely 2 years earlier. Well, they were now being deployed to break open a second Asian empire. The logistics ran through India as well. The horses, the remounts, the supplies, and of course the opium itself all flowed from that very same imperial machine. And seen from Beijing, the thing advancing up the road wasn't a country, it was a systematic killing machine from a system that had been doing it for a very long time. The emperor thankfully didn't stay to meet his guests. He actually gathered his court and fled beyond the Great Wall to the hunting palaces, pleading an autumn hunting expedition that nobody, of course, believed. And left behind to face the foreigners was his half-brother, a capable, unenviable young man known to history as Prince Gong. And of course, the emperor would never see his half-brother again. Which brings me kind of back to where I started with this story, the garden. Allied troops reached the Yangmianyang in early October 1860, ahead of any formal kind of surrender, and found it essentially undefended. The court was gone, the eunuchs had scattered, and a century and a half of accumulated imperial treasure was sitting in silent pavilions. What followed first was a looting on a scale and with an abandon that shocked even the participants. Soldiers wandered out of pavilions draped in imperial silks, pockets full of jade, porcelains that had survived 400 years were smashed for their gold fittings. French accounts blamed British indiscipline. British diaries marveled at French rapacity. And of course, both were right. Objects from those days, well, you know what? They're still surfacing in European auction houses a century and a half later to recurring diplomatic fury. Some of the loot, I have to say, also had a very strange afterlife. In the European section of the gardens, you know, the ones that I described, designed by the Jesuits, marble palaces, well, there stood there an elaborate fountain clock, 12 bronze animal heads, and signs of the Chinese zodiac, you know, each sprouting water in its allotted 2-hour turn. Something to absolutely marvel at. Well, the heads were hacked off and carried away in 1860, and they've been surfacing ever since in Paris auction rooms, in private collections, and of course, making headlines. Chinese buyers, you know, some patriotic billionaires, some state-backs have paid tens of millions to bring individual heads home. One French luxury goods family actually returned 2 of them as a diplomatic gesture. And of course, several of them are still missing. 160 years on, the sale of a single bronze head from the Summer Palace remains, rightfully so, front page news in China, which tells you something about how thoroughly unfinished this story actually is. One item of plunder that actually deserves its own sentence is a small Pekingese dog, a breed that was actually unknown in Europe at that stage, but it had been bred for centuries inside the imperial palaces and nowhere else on earth. Well, she was actually brought home and presented to Queen Victoria, who named her with a candor that a modern reader can only admire, Luty. And there is a portrait if you want to Google it, and she does look quite comfortable. Then days later came the decision that actually separates this episode from an ordinary war. The fate of the truce party became known. You know, the deaths and the manner of them. The British Commander-in-Chief and Lord Elgin resolved that the Queen Court must suffer a punishment that it would actually feel personally. Elgin reasoned it through with chilling clarity. An indemnity would be paid by the Chinese people, not the court. Demanding the torturers' heads would produce scapegoats. Burning the Forbidden City, which some voices urged, might bring down the dynasty altogether. And Britain, already holding one mutinous subcontinent, well, I think they concluded that they didn't want to do the same in China. It wanted China governable, and for sure it wanted it compliant. You know, kind of you broke it, you bought it, and of course nobody wanted to buy it. But the garden was the emperor's own. It was his home. It was his family's creation. It was the thing he loved the most. Destroying it would punish the throne personally, while leaving the instrument of government standing to sign what it was told to sign. So, mid-October 1860, British troops moved through the Garden of Perfect Brightness with torches, methodically burning building by building. The French, who had led the looting, declined to join the burning. Effectively, a division of labor history has enjoyed pointing out ever since. And it took days. There were hundreds of structures spread over miles, and the work was thorough. The smoke drifted over Beijing, visible from the city walls, and ash fell in the streets like grey snow. Along with the pavilions burned things no indemnity should ever have burned. Libraries, archives, paintings, the accumulated irreplaceable record for centuries. Even at the time, plenty of people understood exactly what it was. Victor Hugo, asked his opinion by a French officer expecting congratulations, wrote back in a public letter that has outlived almost everything else written about the war. 2 robbers, he said, had broken into a museum. One had plundered, the other had burned, and history would call them France and England. We Europeans are the civilized ones, he wrote, and for us, the Chinese are the barbarians. This is what civilization has done to barbarianism. Elgin never pretended it was anything other than what it was. He called it a solemn act of retribution and defended it to his death. And of course, you don't have to accept the defense. I don't. The man who ordered one of the great acts of cultural destruction in recorded history didn't do it in rage, but after a careful weighing of alternatives as the modern option. And I think, folks, that's the 19th century in a single fact. So Prince Gong actually signed everything. The Convention of Peking that October actually ratified the Tientsin treaties and added the interest accrued by 2 years of war. The indemnities were enlarged. Tianjin itself was open to trade. The tip of the Kowloon Peninsula facing Hong Kong across the harbor was ceded to Britain outright. Chinese subjects gained the right to emigrate on foreign ships, which in practice blessed the coolie trade, that grim traffic in indentured labor, to the plantations and railways of the Americas, which, some of my contemporaries have called, without much exaggeration, the new slave trade. Ambassadors would reside permanently in Beijing, missionaries could hold property in the interior, and opium flowed legally now towards its late century peak. The Russians who hadn't fired a shot presented their account last and collected most of all. For services rendered as honest broker, well, they got the vast maritime territories east of the Usuri River, where they promptly founded a naval station and called it Vladivostok. Of all the empires at the table, the one that took the most had never fought at all. And for the emperor himself, well, he never returned. He died the following summer beyond the wall at age 30, of illness, of depression, and the Chinese sources say of heartbreak over the garden. There's no reason to actually doubt that. His heir was a boy of 5. And in the regency intrigue that followed, the child's mother outmaneuvered the appointed regents in a palace coup of speed and perfect ruthlessness and emerged as the power behind the throne. History knows her as the Empress Dowager Cixi, and she would dominate China for almost half a century. And you know what? If this were a film, that would actually be the closing shot before the credits. A young woman in the mourning draped palace holding a 5-year-old emperor by the hand. But let me just finish with this. Step back then and ask what the 2 Opium Wars actually did. Because the strange truth is that China was never conquered. And that turned out, I think, to be its own kind of fate. China actually kept its emperor, its bureaucracy, its flag. What it lost was actually harder to see and harder to repair. Control over its own ports, its own tariffs, its own laws, as they applied to foreigners for sure, its own capital's diplomatic space, and hardest of all, the founding assumptions of its civilization, that China was the center and summit of the human world. Historians sometimes call this particular arrangement semi-colonialism, which sounds gentler than colonization, and in one respect, I think it's crueler. The dynasty was actually left standing precisely so it could be made to enforce foreign privileges on its own people. Every treaty port, every missionary dispute settled over the heads of local officials, every customs port run by foreign inspectors. Each one transferred a little more of the government's legitimacy from Beijing to the barbarians. And Beijing remained responsible for keeping order among a population that could see exactly who was actually in charge. The institutions rotted from the inside for 2 more generations, but of course then collapsed in 1911 into a century of warlords, invasion, and revolution. And of course, in China, none of this is obscure history. You know, the period that began in 1839 has a name, the Century of Humiliation, and it's got an end date, 1949. Every Chinese schoolchild learns it. The ruins of the Summer Palace were deliberately left unrestored, effectively a national scar kept visible. And they're still visited today the way other nations visit war graves. And yes, the modern Chinese state tells this story deliberately. It teaches it systematically, and it finds it politically, of course, very, very useful. A narrative, I think, can be genuinely felt and officially convenient at the same time. But consider what happens when Western governments lecture Beijing on international law and human rights. Think about that. Chinese listeners of every political stripe reply, with a certain acid patience, where was this rule book that you're preaching in 1842? Anyone who wants to understand the modern world needs to grasp why that answer lands. The Opium Wars are barely remembered in Britain. In fact, I haven't heard anyone talk about them for the last 20, 30 years. However, they are the origin story in China. That asymmetry of memory is itself one of the war's most durable products. And the drug that started it all? Imports climbed to their peak late in the century and then were undercut. Poppies actually spread across whole provinces until China grew far more opium than it had ever bought. And by 1906, by some estimates, a staggering share of adult Chinese men smoked at least occasionally. It took a remarkable convergence to break that trade. A reforming Qing court, a rising international anti-narcotics movement, and of course a British Liberal government finally willing in 1907 to negotiate the Indian trade down to 0 on a 10-year schedule. The last legal chess from India arrived in the twilight of the First World War. A quiet end, if you like, to the commerce 2 wars had been fought to protect. Addiction itself, well, that lasted longer through warlord years when armies on all sides taxed the poppy to buy their rifles. Then the new communist state stamped out mass addiction in the early 1950s with the tools of total mobilization. Treatment for users, bullets for traffickers. So let's end where we began 2 episodes ago. A bright shop on a Victorian high street, jars of coloured glass, a bottle of laudanum sold with no questions asked. Everything we've watched since, the fleets, the treaties, the burning gardens, the century of grievance that still shapes headlines today, flows from a single gap. The gap between how ordinary that bottle looked in London and what its trade was doing 8,000 miles away. Empires are very good at not looking at that gap. It's the oldest trick, I think, in the imperial book, and the simplest. The habit stays at home, and the bill goes abroad. And the bill, as we've seen, eventually comes due for everyone. Thanks for listening in, folks. If you've enjoyed these 2 episodes, please share them with someone who thinks the Victorians were mostly about railways and table manners. This episode of Rearview Mirror Chronicles is brought to you by Entrepot Publishing, the home of independent storytelling. We publish books that celebrate history, art, and the extraordinary people who make life fascinating. You can find our titles and maybe your next great read at entrepotpublishing.com. Bye for now.